So in music production, you hear people talk about EQ. You hear it all the time. So EQ this, EQ that, put an EQ on this. What are they talking about? What is an EQ? Well, today I'm going to explain to you what an EQ is, how it works, and why it is so very, very important in music production. Hey everyone, my name is Supercy Jules. Welcome to Supercy and welcome to this series called Studio 101. In this series, I'm focusing on the basics of music production. So especially if you're new to music production, then stick around, consider subscribing, and pay attention. Okay, so what is an EQ? Well, let me first say that, you might or might not know that sound is basically vibrations. And simply put, you might say that the slower the vibration, the lower the frequency and the lower the pitch. Now, the faster the vibration, the higher the frequency and the higher the pitch. And any sound spans across a certain frequency range. All right? Now, again, what is an EQ? Well, this is not an EQ. This is just a spectrum analyzer. And what a spectrum analyzer does is it'll give you a visual presentation of any sound. And what it visualizes is the magnitude of any frequency within a sound. Okay, so as you can see, the x-axis, that represents the frequencies, so the frequency range, and it ranges from 20 to 20,000 hertz, which is pretty standard, and there's a very, very good reason for that. Because 20 to 20,000 hertz, that is the frequency range that the human ear is able to hear, roughly. Okay, so anything below 20 hertz, we're not able to hear. Anything above 20,000 hertz, we're not able to hear. You know, that is why on most equipment, music equipment, this is the range you're going to see from 20 to 20,000 hertz. Now, the y-axis on this spectrum analyzer, that represents the magnitude or the intensity, or to put it simply, the volume. All right? Now, let me just make a sound and you'll see what I mean. Okay, now as you can see, the most energy of this sound goes here, so around 292.8 hertz, something like that. Now here, so around 15,000 hertz, there is almost nothing, there's almost no volume. All right, so those are just two conclusions you could draw from watching this spectrum meter. Now this is a volume knob. And we all know this. I mean, it's the same thing on your radio or on your television or, it's probably not a knob, but it's the same thing. It's very similar to something like this. On your remote control, you have a volume controller up or down. The same thing on your smartphone, you have up or down volume. So it's exactly the same. Now, what will happen if I engage this volume controller? So let's say I'm increasing the volume, and let me do that, and let me increase it by, 6.1 dB. I'm going to play that same sound, and let's see what happens. Okay, so what happens is, yes, of course, the volume is a bit louder, but the shape of the sound, so to speak, is exactly the same. Same thing if I lower the volume, and let me again play that same sound. You can see the shape is exactly the same, only the volume is lower. All right? So this means that a volume controller like this is global. So it will affect all the frequencies equally. Now for the third time, what on earth is an EQ? Well, this is an EQ. An EQ is actually also a kind of volume controller. The difference with the global volume controller is that with an EQ, you can actually single out certain frequencies or certain frequency ranges. So you can boost or cut certain frequencies and leave others unaffected. All right? And with an EQ like this, there are basically three ways to do that. Now, the first thing you can do is you can take a certain frequency and you can cut away everything below that frequency. So as you can see here, this is a so-called low cut filter. If I engage this, you will see over here exactly what it does. By the way, this is also a kind of spectrum analyzer built into this EQ, very similar to the spectrum analyzer I just showed you before. So it's built into this EQ, which is not absolutely necessary for an EQ to have. Not all EQs have that, but it can be very handy, and especially if you're just beginning, it sometimes helps to see what you're actually doing visually. All right. Now, if I engage this low cut filter, you will see what it does. It'll take 75 Hertz, which is here, as a starting point, and it cuts away everything below that. And this sets the slope at which it does that. So it's now set to 12 dB per octave, but you can set it to 24 dB per octave, which looks like this. Or you can set it to 36, so you can make that slope a little bit steeper. All right, so that is how a low cut filter works. By the way, low cut filter is also referred to as a high pass filter. So it's a kind of filter that lets the high frequencies pass. So anything above 75 Hertz is unaffected. Anything below is cut away. So two names for the same thing, low cut filter or high pass filter. Now on the other side of the spectrum, it works exactly the same, only then you are cutting away everything above a certain frequency. So this is a so-called high cut filter. Makes sense, right? If I engage this, you will see that it works very similarly to a low cut filter. It's just on the other side of the spectrum. Okay, so high cut filter, you've guessed it, it's also referred to as a low pass filter. Now the second thing you can do is to apply what is called a shelf. So what is a shelf? Again, you take a certain frequency and you can either boost or decrease the volume of all the frequencies below that frequency. And it looks something like this. So this is boosting everything below 110 Hertz, and this is also referred to as cutting everything below 110 Hertz. So this is a low shelf. There's also a high shelf, and you can do the same thing on the other side of the spectrum, and it looks like this. And by the way, you can also set the slope right here. You can make it shallower or steeper, and that is a shelf. Now the third and final thing you can do with an EQ like this is you can apply a so-called bell-shaped filter or peak filter. So what it is, again, choose a certain frequency. Let's choose 500 Hertz in this example. And we can now increase or decrease the volume of that particular frequency. And it looks something like this. And maybe now you also understand why it's called bell-shaped. What you can see, what you can make out from the image is that some of the surrounding frequencies are also affected. But you can control how narrow or how wide this shape is, and thereby control how many frequencies are actually affected. And you do that by controlling what is called the Q. To be honest, I've never actually really known why it is called Q, and I don't think I really need to know. I just know that it does, and I know what it does. So if we mess with this knob right here, let's call it the Q knob, again you can narrow this shape, or you can widen the shape. And obviously, the wider it gets, the more frequencies will get affected. Okay, so what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna play that same piano sound. But while I'm playing, I'm gonna make some changes to the settings of the EQ so you know what it actually does. Okay, let's go. So that is the original sound. Now let's apply a low cut filter. And a high cut filter. Okay, now let's apply a shelf. Sorry, this is a shelf. And a high shelf. Okay, and finally a bell shape modification. So as you can see, And here especially, you can make some dramatic changes to the sound with an EQ. Now, why might an EQ be useful? Well, there are several reasons. One of them is, as I mentioned, you can make some dramatic changes to sounds with an EQ. So, sound design, in a way, that's one reason. Another reason is you can clean up sounds, so to speak. A very good example of that is when people record vocals. There are some frequencies below, usually below 100 hertz, 120 hertz, something like that, which are considered not really relevant. It's actually considered as being as rumble. You know, it's not really relevant. So what people tend to do is they will cut away everything below 100 hertz or 120 hertz, because if it's not relevant, you don't need it, it can only get in the way. So then better to get rid of it, okay? So that way you get a much cleaner sound, so to speak. And another very important reason is, in mixing especially, is you can create some separation. So you might have, within one song, you might have two sounds that reside, so to speak, within a very similar frequency range. Well, that can be a problem because both of them are competing for that range. So you can increase the volume of one of those sounds, but that will result in that sound masking the other sound or eclipsing, in a way, the other sound, so you won't hear it anymore. And that's not what you want. So what you can do is you can bring in some EQs and you can mess around with some settings. So for instance, you can boost some of the frequencies of one of those sounds and cut away exactly those same frequencies on the other sound, and vice versa. And that way you create some separation, and hopefully the result will be that you can hear both of those sounds clearly in the mix. Now, in my opinion, an EQ is one of the most important, if not the most important tool when it comes to mixing music. And if you're not familiar with it, I would suggest just play around with it. Just mess around with it as much as possible, because that is the only way to familiarize yourself with it and to get a feel of it and to feel when to use it and how to use it. So that's about it about what an EQ is. If you have any questions, then let me know. Leave a comment below. Now, if you want to see more videos like this, then again, consider subscribing. For now, just thank you for watching, and I will talk to you very soon.